Welcome. Today we're doing something a little different. We're stepping inside a courtroom, but the defendant, well, it isn't a person, it's a book. An ancient, really controversial book. We are putting the book of Daniel on trial. And the charge? It's a big one. Fraud. We're going to sift through the evidence and try to answer one huge question. Is this book a real, genuine eyewitness account from the 6th century B.C.E., or is it one of the most clever forgeries in history? So, let's really get into character here. Imagine you're in the jury box. Your job is to listen carefully, to weigh all the evidence for the prosecution and for the defense, and to figure out what's really going on with this ancient text. All right, so let's get formally introduced to the accused, the book of Daniel. It claims to be written by a Hebrew prophet, a man named Daniel, who was living in Babylon way back during the Jewish exile. And it's packed with some pretty wild stories. But more importantly, it's filled with these incredibly specific prophecies about the rise and fall of world empires. Now, the prosecution's argument is honestly pretty straightforward. They're calling it a fraud. For centuries, critics have said that this book is just, well, it's too accurate. They argue that these aren't real prophecies about the future. They're just history, written down after it all happened to look like prophecy. And here's the heart of the accusation. The theory goes like this. Some unknown writer, living through this really tough time in the 2nd century B.C.E., wrote the book to give his people hope. He basically took history they all knew and disguised it to look like amazing predictions. But the question for us, the jury, is, does the evidence actually back that up? Okay, let's bring in the prosecution's first major piece of evidence. Exhibit A. For a long, long time, this was their smoking gun, a king who, they claimed, never even existed.
For centuries, critics would point to this and say, see, ancient historians say the last king of Babylon was a guy named Nabonidus. This Belshazzar from the book of Daniel, he's a ghost. He doesn't show up anywhere else. The conclusion felt pretty obvious. The author just made him up. But then archaeology had a little something to say about that.
And this is where the trial takes a really dramatic twist. Look at this timeline. In 1854, these old clay cylinders get dug up. And guess what name is on them? Belshazzar. That's Belshazzar, named as the son of King Nabonidus. Later discoveries confirm that, yeah, he was basically co-king while his dad was out of town. All of a sudden, the missing monarch wasn't missing anymore. The whole charge got turned on its head.
So here's where it gets really fascinating. This discovery makes other little details in the story just click. For instance, Daniel calls Belshazzar the son of Nebuchadnezzar, but in these ancient languages, that word could easily mean grandson or descendant, which he was. But here's the kicker. When Belshazzar is totally terrified and wants to reward Daniel, he offers him the 3rd highest spot in the kingdom. 3rd? Why not 2nd? Because, as we now know, the 1st and 2nd spots were already taken by King Nabonidus and by Belshazzar himself. Now, would a forger writing hundreds of years later know that subtle little fact? Highly unlikely. But an eyewitness? Absolutely. What was once the biggest piece of evidence against Daniel became one of the strongest points for it. All right, let's move on to the prosecution's Exhibit B. They've got a couple more historical puzzles they want to talk about. But the defense argues that these so-called mistakes are actually more proof that the book is the real deal. So, just like with Belshazzar, critics say Darius the Mede is a fictional character because, well, we can't find him in other historical records under that name. But the defense comes back and says, hang on, Darius might have been a title, kind of like Pharaoh or Caesar, not a personal name. They think he might be a powerful governor named Gabaru, who we know was put in charge of Babylon. The point is, just because our surviving records are incomplete doesn't mean an eyewitness account is wrong.
And then there's this apparent contradiction in the very first verse of the book. Daniel says something happened in King Jehoiakim's 3rd year, but the prophet Jeremiah seems to say it was the 4th year. The defense says, whoa, not so fast. It's not a mistake, it's just a different point of view. See, Jeremiah was writing from Jerusalem, and he counted one way. Daniel was writing from Babylon, where they counted things differently. And you have to ask yourself, if you were a forger, would you really start your book by contradicting a famous, respected prophet like Jeremiah? It seems like a pretty risky move. So the defense isn't just plain defense, they're now ready to present their own evidence. These small, specific, telling details that are pretty hard to explain unless the author actually lived through it all. Okay, check this out. The book is King Nebuchadnezzar bragging about all the incredible buildings he constructed in Babylon. For centuries, that was just a story. Then archaeologists start digging, and they find mountains of bricks, all stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's name, proving he was this massive builder. How on earth would a forger from the 2nd century BCE know that? The book also gets little cultural details right, like having women at a wild royal feast, something that later cultures would have found pretty scandalous and probably wouldn't have just made up. And this slide is just brilliant. It shows how well the author knew the legal systems of the time. In Babylon, the go-to punishment was a fiery furnace. But for the Medes and Persians, fire was sacred, so their punishment of choice was a lion's pit. The book gets that switch exactly right. It also shows the Babylonian king as an absolute ruler, but the Medo-Persian king had to obey the law. He couldn't even change his own decrees. These aren't broad strokes. These are fine-tuned, accurate details. Okay, the defense is now ready to call its final, and they would say most compelling witnesses to the stand. We're moving beyond archaeology now and into the testimony of other ancient, respected texts.
First up, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among these incredible finds were copies of the Book of Daniel, and the dating on them puts them right around the late 2nd century BCE, the exact time critics say the book was being written. For that theory to work, the book would have had to have been written, gain massive respect as scripture, and be copied and distributed practically overnight. It just seems incredibly unlikely. Even better, we have the prophet Ezekiel, who was definitely living at the same time as Daniel. He actually mentions a man named Daniel, right alongside legendary figures like Noah and Job, as a model of righteousness. That puts a real man named Daniel, famous for his wisdom, right in the 6th century BCE, exactly where the book says he was.
But the defense has been holding on to its star witness, their final piece of testimony. In the New Testament, Jesus Christ himself talks about Daniel the prophet, and he even quotes from his book when he's talking about the future. From the perspective of our source material, this is the mic drop moment. This is the ultimate proof. For anyone who accepts the authority of Jesus, the fact that he directly confirms Daniel as a real prophet basically settles the question, making all the other debates secondary. And with that, the trial is over. The case rests. We've heard the serious charge of fraud. We've heard the defense, backed up by archaeology, by tiny internal details, and by powerful external testimony. The verdict is now up to you, the jury. But it leaves us all with one massive follow-up question. If this book is a true, authentic eyewitness account from the 6th century BCE, then what in the world are we supposed to do with its incredibly detailed prophecies?